The second Sunday in May arrived with deceptive tranquility in the affluent Boston suburb of Wellesley. Susan Matthews stood at the kitchen island of her modest colonial home, arranging white carnations in a crystal vase she'd received as a wedding gift 7 years ago. The flowers had been Robert's gesture that morning, delivered with coffee and a hesitant kiss on her forehead before he retreated to his home office. She knew what the distance meant. His mother was coming for brunch, and tension always preceded Patricia Aldridge's arrivals like a cold front moving across Massachusetts. Susan's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the dining table settings. At 32, she'd learned to recognize the warning signs of conflict with her mother-in-law, but today felt different. Patricia had been uncharacteristically silent since Susan announced her pregnancy 3 weeks earlier, a stillness that felt more ominous than her usual pointed criticisms about Susan's middle-class upbringing or her career as a public school art teacher. Robert emerged from his office at 11:30, his sandy hair disheveled, blue eyes avoiding hers. "She'll be here in 20 minutes, he said, straightening his collar with the nervous energy that always surfaced when navigating between his wife and his mother. "Please, Susan. Just, let's get through today without incident." The plea stung. Susan set down the serving spoon with controlled precision, the metallic clink echoing in the suddenly suffocating kitchen. "Without incident," she repeated, her voice low. "Robert, your mother hasn't returned my calls in 3 weeks. She knows I'm pregnant with her first grandchild, and she's been completely silent. She's processing," Robert offered weakly, running his hand through his hair, a gesture Susan had once found endearing, but now recognized as evasion. "You know how she gets about change." What Susan knew was that Patricia Aldridge, widow of pharmaceutical executive Malcolm Aldridge, wielded her $30 million estate like a weapon, and Robert, as her only child, remained perpetually within striking distance. The monthly allowance Patricia provided them, $2,000 that covered their mortgage, came with invisible strings that tightened whenever Susan dared to assert independence. The doorbell rang, and Robert's shoulders tensed visibly. Susan smoothed her navy dress over her still flat stomach and followed her husband to the foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the beveled glass, Patricia's silver Mercedes gleamed in the driveway, a statement of wealth in a neighborhood of comfortable but unremarkable prosperity. Patricia Aldridge entered like visiting royalty, her platinum bob perfectly coiffed, her cream Chanel suit immaculate. At 63, she maintained the sharp elegance of old Boston money, her pale eyes sweeping over Susan with the same appraisal one might give furniture at an estate sale. "Robert, darling," she said, brushing past Susan to embrace her son. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," Robert said, his voice brightening in that way that always made Susan feel like an outsider in her own home. Patricia finally acknowledged Susan with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Susan, you're looking healthy." The word landed like an insult. Susan forced herself to smile, gesturing toward the dining room where she'd spent the morning preparing Patricia's favorite dishes: poached salmon, asparagus with hollandaise, fresh berry tart. "Brunch is ready. I hope you're hungry." "Actually," Patricia said, removing her gloves with deliberate slowness, "I'd like to speak with Robert privately first. Family business." The exclusion was intentional, surgical. Susan felt heat rising in her chest, but kept her voice steady. "Of course, I'll be in the kitchen." She retreated, her hands gripping the granite countertop as she listened to the murmur of voices in the living room. Patricia's clipped tones, Robert's placating responses. 15 minutes passed, each one stretching Susan's composure thinner. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching, and Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway alone, her expression hardened into something resembling contempt. "We need to discuss your situation," Patricia said, dispensing with pretense. Susan straightened, instinctively protective of the life growing inside her. "My pregnancy, you mean? This timing is catastrophically poor judgment," Patricia continued, her voice cold and controlled. "Robert's been passed over for partner at his firm twice. You work a teacher's salary. You can barely manage your current expenses without my assistance, And now you want to bring a child into this instability. The criticism cut deep because it touched Susan's own anxieties, the fears that kept her awake at 3 a.m., calculating daycare costs and maternity leave. But hearing them voiced by Patricia, weaponized into an attack, ignited something fierce in her. "This is our decision," Susan said firmly. "Mine and Robert's." Patricia's laugh was brittle. "Robert doesn't make decisions, he never has. That's why he needs me, to protect him from impulsive mistakes." "I'm not a mistake," Susan said, her voice rising despite her efforts at control. "And neither is our baby." "You trapped him," Patricia hissed, stepping closer, her refined facade cracking to reveal raw anger beneath. "Just like your kind always does, latched onto money and security without earning any of it." The accusation detonated years of accumulated resentment. Susan's vision narrowed, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Get out of my house." "Your house?" Patricia's voice dripped with venom. "I pay your mortgage, you ungrateful little parasite. Everything you have exists because I allow it." The slap came so fast, Susan barely registered the movement before Patricia's palm connected with her cheek, the sharp crack reverberating through the kitchen like a gunshot. Pain exploded across Susan's face, stunning her into momentary paralysis as her hand flew to her burning skin. Robert burst into the kitchen, his face white with shock. "Mom, what the hell?" "She disrespected me in her own home," Patricia said, her composure already reassembling, though her hand trembled slightly. "I won't tolerate being spoken to that way by someone whose existence in this family depends entirely on my generosity." Susan's ears rang, but through the shock, clarity crystallized with brutal precision. She looked at Robert, watching him freeze between the two women who defined his life, and saw with devastating certainty that he would choose the path of least resistance as he always had. The realization hurt worse than the slap. "Leave," Susan said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Both of you. Get out." Patricia gathered her purse with theatrical dignity. Robert reached for Susan, but she stepped back, creating distance that felt suddenly vast and insurmountable. "Susan, please, let's just—" "I said leave," she repeated, and something in her tone made him comply. The door closed behind them, and Susan sank onto the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, her hand still pressed to her throbbing cheek. The carefully prepared brunch sat untouched on the table, the white carnations mocking her with their symbolism of pure love and devotion. Outside, she heard Patricia's Mercedes start, followed by Robert's sedan, separate cars leaving in separate directions, leaving her alone in the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration of motherhood. As the adrenaline ebbed, Susan became aware of her phone in her dress pocket. She pulled it out with shaking hands and opened the camera, taking photos of her reddening cheek from multiple angles, documenting the evidence with the same methodical care she brought to lesson planning. She didn't know yet what she would do with these images, but instinct told her that Patricia Aldridge had finally overplayed her hand, and Susan would need proof of the moment. Everything changed. Chapter 2. The Reckoning. By Monday morning, Susan's cheek bore a faint bruise that makeup couldn't fully conceal. She called in sick to Wellesley Middle School, unable to face her students' inevitable questions, and instead sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a determination that felt like ice in her veins. Robert had stayed at a hotel Sunday night after Susan refused to answer his calls, his text messages alternating between apologies and pleas that she understand his mother's perspective, the perspective of a woman who'd struck a pregnant daughter-in-law. Susan's hand moved to her stomach, still flat but holding the tiny promise of a future that suddenly seemed impossibly complicated. She opened a new browser window and typed, "Assault by family member, Massachusetts legal options." The search results flooded her screen with information about domestic violence, restraining orders, and pressing charges. Massachusetts law was clear. Assault and battery, even a slap, constituted criminal behavior, regardless of family relationship. Susan's teaching salary had never afforded her much power in her marriage, but the law, she realized, didn't care about Patricia Aldridge's bank account. Her phone buzzed. Robert again. This time she answered, her voice flat. "What? Can I come home?" He sounded exhausted, and despite everything, Susan felt a pang of sympathy for the man she'd loved enough to marry, the man who'd been shaped by Patricia's suffocating control since childhood. "We need to talk, Susan. Really talk." "Then talk," she said, staring at the legal articles on her screen. "My mother, she's willing to apologize," Robert began, and Susan actually laughed, a harsh sound that surprised them both. "She hit me, Robert. She committed assault because I wouldn't let her insult me in my own home." Susan's voice hardened. "And you stood there trying to figure out how to smooth it over instead of defending your pregnant wife." The silence on the line stretched thin. When Robert finally spoke, his voice cracked. "I know. God, Susan, I know I failed you yesterday. I've been failing you for years, trying to keep peace between you and my mother, instead of setting boundaries." The admission shocked her into silence. Robert continued, words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been so afraid of losing her support. Financially, yes, but also her approval, which I know is pathetic for a 35-year-old man to admit. But watching her hit you, seeing your face," his voice broke completely. "I can't do this anymore, I won't." Susan wanted to believe him. 7 years of marriage had taught her to recognize Robert's patterns of appeasement, his inability to stand up to Patricia's emotional manipulation. But she'd also seen genuine anguish in his eyes yesterday, a breaking point she'd never witnessed before. "What does that mean, Robert? What does 'won't do this anymore' actually look like?" "It means I'm cutting her off," he said, the words coming stronger now. "No more monthly allowance for us. No more letting her dictate our decisions. I'm choosing you and our baby, Susan. I should have done it years ago." The financial reality hit Susan like cold water. Without Patricia's $2,000 monthly, they'd struggle to make their mortgage payments. Robert's income as an associate attorney covered their basic expenses, but barely, and Susan's teaching salary disappeared into student loans and car payments. Adding a baby to that equation without Patricia's safety net seemed terrifyingly reckless. But staying tethered to a woman who'd physically assaulted her felt impossible. "Where does that leave us?" Susan asked quietly. "Selling the house," Robert said, and she could hear him pacing, the hotel room sounds in the background. "Moving somewhere smaller, more affordable. I've already started looking at apartments in Framingham. We could cut our housing costs in half. It'll be tight, especially with the baby coming, but we can make it work without her money." Susan closed her laptop, the legal articles forgotten momentarily as she processed this version of her husband she barely recognized. "She won't accept this, Robert. Your mother doesn't lose gracefully." "I don't care," Robert said, and for the first time in their marriage, Susan believed him. "Come home," she said finally. "We have a lot to figure out." Robert arrived within the hour, his overnight bag in hand, his appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he hadn't slept. They sat at the kitchen table, where Susan had documented her bruise the day before, and for the first time in years had a conversation without the ghost of Patricia Aldridge hovering between them. "I need you to understand something," Susan said, her fingers wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. "What your mother did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal assault. I have photos. I could press charges." Robert's face paled, but he nodded slowly. "I know. You'd be within your rights." "I'm not saying I will," Susan continued carefully, "but I need to know that you fully understand the severity of what happened. This wasn't a disagreement or a family squabble. Your mother crossed a legal and moral line." "She did," Robert agreed, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since he'd arrived home. "And if you decide to pursue charges, I'll support you. Hell, I'll testify if needed. No more protecting her from consequences." The words settled something in Susan's chest, a knot of tension loosening fractionally. "I want a written agreement," she said, surprising herself with the clarity of her thinking. "If we're cutting ties with your mother financially, I need guarantees that we won't go crawling back the first time things get difficult. You sell the house, we move somewhere we can actually afford, and Patricia has no financial leverage over our family anymore." Robert pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, his fingers moving across the screen. "I'm writing it down right now. We list the house this week, find an apartment by the end of the month, and transition to complete financial independence from my mother before the baby arrives in December." Susan watched him type, documenting promises that represented a fundamental restructuring of their life. Outside, spring afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes and the wilting carnations from yesterday's disaster. The house suddenly felt like a beautiful prison they were preparing to escape. "There's something else," Robert said, looking up from his phone. "I've been in therapy before, back in college, when I first realized how controlling my mother was. I need to go back, not just for me, but for us and the baby." The admission surprised Susan more than anything else he'd said. Robert had always resisted therapy, dismissing it as unnecessary self-indulgence. "I think that's a good idea," she said softly. They spent the rest of Monday afternoon researching apartments and calculating budgets, the practical work of rebuilding their life from a foundation not constructed by Patricia Aldridge's money. It felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff while trusting wings would appear. That evening, Patricia called Robert's phone 17 times. He silenced it after the 5th call, his jaw set with unfamiliar determination. "She's going to escalate," Susan warned, remembering years of witnessing Patricia's reactions to even minor defiance. "Let her," Robert said, and pulled Susan close, his hand resting protectively on her stomach, where their child grew, oblivious to the family storm gathering around its existence. "We're done dancing to her tune." Chapter 3. The Fallout. Patricia Aldridge did not handle rejection quietly. By Wednesday, 3 days after Mother's Day, she'd called Robert's office so many times, his assistant started screening her calls. She sent text messages that oscillated between furious accusations and tearful apologies, none of which addressed the assault, all of which centered on her feelings of betrayal. Susan returned to work Tuesday. The bruise on her cheek faded to a shadow she covered with foundation. Her students at Wellesley Middle School were in the final push before summer break, their energy chaotic and unfocused, which suited Susan's scattered mental state perfectly. Between classes, she scrolled through apartment listings, each one smaller and shabbier than their current colonial, each one representing freedom from Patricia's financial dominance. During lunch period, Susan's phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Hello? Susan Matthews?" A woman's professional voice, crisp and businesslike. "This is Jennifer Caldwell from Caldwell Family Law. Patricia Aldridge retained our firm and requested I reach out regarding a family matter." Susan's stomach dropped. She stepped into the hallway away from the cafeteria noise. "Patricia hired a lawyer. Mrs. Aldridge has concerns about the welfare of her future grandchild," Jennifer continued smoothly. "She's prepared to pursue grandparent visitation rights and wants to ensure the child will be raised in financially stable circumstances. Given your family's current dependence on her support, she feels it's prudent to establish legal frameworks now." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Patricia was weaponizing her wealth, threatening a custody fight before their baby was even born. Susan's free hand moved protectively to her stomach. "Tell Mrs. Aldridge that any communication about my child goes through my attorney." "You've retained counsel?" Jennifer sounded surprised, as though she'd expected Susan to crumble immediately. "I will have by end of business today," Susan said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And Ms. Caldwell, you might want to ask your client about the assault she committed against me on Mother's Day. I have photographic evidence." She ended the call before Jennifer could respond, her hands shaking. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, and Susan stood in the empty hallway, watching her students stream past toward afternoon classes, their young faces uncomplicated by the adult conflicts that suddenly consumed her life. That evening, Susan met with Rachel Kim, a family law attorney whose name appeared repeatedly in positive reviews from women navigating difficult divorces and custody battles. Rachel's office in Framingham was modest but professional, decorated with children's artwork from grateful clients. She listened intently as Susan recounted Sunday's events, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You have a strong case for a restraining order," Rachel said after Susan finished, her dark eyes sympathetic but direct. "Assault, especially against a pregnant woman, is taken seriously in Massachusetts courts. The photos help establish evidence. But will it protect us from her trying to take our baby?" Susan asked, voicing the fear that had gnawed at her since Jennifer's call. Rachel leaned back in her chair, considering. "Grandparent rights in Massachusetts are limited. Patricia would need to prove that denying her access causes harm to the child, which is a high legal bar, especially for an infant. Her wealth doesn't automatically grant her custody rights. However," Rachel paused significantly, "if she can demonstrate that you and Robert are financially unstable or unfit parents, she might make a case for increased involvement." The strategy became clear. Patricia planned to use their financial dependence on her as proof of instability, then position herself as the solution, the stable grandparent who could provide what Susan and Robert couldn't. It was manipulation elevated to legal warfare. "We're selling our house and cutting all financial ties with her," Susan explained, outlining the plan she and Robert had developed. "We'll be in a smaller apartment, but completely independent." Rachel nodded approvingly. "That strengthens your position significantly. Document everything, your budget, your plans, your ability to provide for this child without Patricia's money." And Susan? Rachel's expression softened. Consider filing for that restraining order. Not just for legal protection, but to establish clear boundaries. Your mother-in-law needs to understand there are consequences for her actions. Susan left Rachel's office with a retainer agreement and a timeline for legal action. The May evening was warm, the suburban streets lined with families walking dogs and children riding bikes, normalcy that felt impossibly distant from her current reality. She drove home to find Robert already there, his laptop open at the kitchen table, surrounded by real estate printouts. "I found 3 apartments we can afford," he said, looking up as she entered. "All in Framingham, near the train line so I can still commute to Boston. Not fancy, but clean and safe." Susan set down her bag and joined him at the table, studying the listings. 1-bedroom apartments that would require converting their living room once the baby arrived, kitchens a fraction of their current size, shared laundry facilities instead of their own machines. It represented a dramatic lifestyle downgrade, a reality Patricia would undoubtedly weaponize as evidence of their inadequacy. But it also represented choice, their choice, free from Patricia's puppet strings. "Your mother hired a lawyer," Susan said, and watched Robert's face harden. She explained Jennifer's call and her meeting with Rachel, the threat of a custody battle that hadn't even begun yet. "She's escalating exactly like you predicted," Robert said quietly, his hands clenching into fists. "She can't accept losing control." "Rachel thinks I should file for a restraining order," Susan continued, watching his reaction carefully. "It would legally prohibit your mother from contacting me or coming near me. Robert, that includes you visiting her without me." The implications settled between them. Susan wasn't just cutting ties with Patricia. She was asking Robert to do the same completely. For several long moments he stared at the apartment listings without seeing them. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "File it. She hit you, Susan. That's unforgivable." The support meant everything. Susan reached across the table, taking his hand. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," she warned. "I know," Robert said, squeezing her fingers. "But we're doing this together. No more choosing her over you, I mean that." They spent the evening touring the 3 Framingham apartments virtually, narrowing their choice to a 2-bedroom unit in a recently renovated building near the commuter rail station. The rent was $1,200 monthly, $1,000 less than their current mortgage payment when removing Patricia's contribution. It had updated appliances, good natural light, and a 2nd bedroom just large enough for a nursery. "This one," Susan said, feeling something like hope stir beneath the anxiety. "We can make this work." Robert called the landlord immediately, securing a viewing for Friday and submitting their application. As he negotiated lease terms, Susan pulled up the photos of her bruised cheek from Sunday, the evidence that had started this cascade of change. Tomorrow she would deliver them to Rachel, along with written documentation of Patricia's assault, beginning the legal process that would sever the Aldridge family connection forever. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, but Susan recognized Patricia's particular brand of passive-aggressive phrasing immediately. "I've loved Robert since before you existed in his life. You're taking my son from me and poisoning him against his only parent. This cruelty will have consequences." Susan showed the message to Robert, who read it with visible disgust. "Save it," he said grimly. "Evidence for Rachel." Outside, spring darkness settled over Wellesley, their last weeks in the house they'd thought would be their forever home, counting down like a clock. Susan stood at the kitchen window, her reflection ghostly in the glass, her hand resting on her stomach, where new life grew despite the chaos swirling around it. Behind her, Robert made notes on their apartment application, his voice steady and determined as he spoke with their potential new landlord. They were burning their old life down. But from those ashes, Susan thought, they might finally build something Patricia Aldridge's money couldn't touch. Chapter 4. New Foundation. The restraining order was granted on May 20th, 2 weeks after Mother's Day. Judge Maria Santos reviewed Susan's photos, read the documented timeline of Patricia's harassment, and issued a 1-year protective order prohibiting Patricia from contacting Susan directly or coming within 200 yards of her. The courtroom was sterile and fluorescent lit, nothing like the dramatic legal proceedings Susan had seen on television, but the weight of the document she carried out felt monumental. Patricia didn't attend the hearing. Her attorney, Jennifer Caldwell, appeared instead, arguing that the order was unnecessarily harsh and would prevent Patricia from developing a relationship with her grandchild. Judge Santos was unimpressed. "Mrs. Aldridge committed assault against a pregnant woman," the judge said flatly. Until she demonstrates genuine accountability and anger management, she poses a threat to Ms. Matthews' physical safety. Grandparent access concerns are secondary to victim protection. Robert sat beside Susan throughout the hearing, his presence solid and supportive in a way she'd desperately needed for years. Afterward, in the courthouse parking lot, he pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to settle some of the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "One step done," he murmured against her hair. The house sold faster than anticipated. A young couple with tech money loved the Colonial's classic New England charm and didn't blink at the asking price. Susan and Robert closed on June 15th, walking away with enough equity to cover moving costs, pay off Susan's remaining student loans, and establish a modest emergency fund for the baby's arrival. The financial freedom felt almost disorienting after years of Patricia's monetary control. Their new apartment in Framingham was everything the listings promised: clean, bright, significantly smaller. Susan spent her first summer break in 7 years not traveling or relaxing, but instead transforming a sparse second bedroom into a nursery. She painted the walls a soft sage green, assembled a second-hand crib Robert found on Facebook Marketplace, and arranged her grandmother's rocking chair near the window where morning light streamed in. It was modest compared to the Pinterest-perfect nurseries she'd once envisioned, but it felt entirely theirs, untainted by Patricia's influence. Robert started therapy in early June with Dr. Marcus Chen, a psychologist specializing in family systems and enmeshment. He came home from sessions emotionally raw, processing decades of Patricia's manipulation with new vocabulary: emotional incest, parentification, conditional love. Susan watched her husband emerge from the fog of his mother's control, like someone learning to walk after years of paralysis. The process painful, but necessary. "She never saw me as separate from her," Robert explained one evening in late June, the two of them sitting on their small balcony overlooking the parking lot. "Dr. Chen says she treated me like a replacement for my father after he died. Her emotional support, her purpose, her possession. Any independence I showed threatened her identity." Susan sipped her decaf iced coffee, 7 months pregnant now, her body a visible reminder of the independence that had triggered Patricia's violent response. "Does understanding it make it easier?" she asked. Robert considered, his profile silhouetted against the sunset. "Not easier, just clearer. I spent 35 years trying to be enough for her, and it was never going to be possible, because what she wanted wasn't a son, it was a captive audience for her loneliness." The insight was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Susan reached for his hand, their fingers interlacing. "You're enough for me," she said quietly. "You're enough for our daughter." They'd learned at the 20-week ultrasound they were having a girl, and the knowledge made everything more tangible. Susan was carrying a daughter who would grow up watching how her parents navigated conflict, set boundaries, chose courage over compliance. The responsibility felt enormous. Patricia attempted contact twice, despite the restraining order. The first time she sent flowers to Susan's school in September, with a card reading "For my granddaughter's mother." Susan documented it and reported it to the police, resulting in a warning letter to Patricia from the court. The second time, in October, Patricia appeared at Robert's law firm demanding to see him. Building security escorted her out, and Robert filed a formal complaint with the court. "She's not going to stop," Susan said after the second incident, 34 weeks pregnant and exhausted from interrupted sleep and constant vigilance. "Probably not," Robert agreed, his therapy with Dr. Chen apparently teaching him to accept uncomfortable truths. "But we control our boundaries, Susan. She can keep pushing and we keep holding the line. Eventually she'll either respect it or face escalating legal consequences." The clarity was new for Robert, hard-won through months of therapeutic work. Susan watched him draft another restraining order violation report with the same methodical attention he brought to legal briefs, and felt grateful for the man he was becoming when freed from his mother's gravitational pull. Their daughter, Emma Catherine Matthews, arrived on December 3rd during an early snowstorm that blanketed Framingham in unexpected quiet. Susan's labor was long and difficult, 36 hours that left her depleted but euphoric when they finally placed Emma on her chest. Robert cried openly, his hands shaking as he touched his daughter's impossibly small fingers, and Susan saw in his face the same determination that had carried them through the past 7 months. "She's perfect," Robert whispered, and Susan knew he wasn't just talking about Emma's features, but about the future she represented, a family built on choice and commitment rather than obligation and control. They brought Emma home to the Framingham apartment 3 days later, navigating new parenthood in their small space with more grace than Susan anticipated. Night feedings in the sage green nursery, the rocking chair's rhythmic creak, Emma's tiny sounds of contentment, these became their new normal. Robert took 2 weeks paternity leave, and they existed in a sleep-deprived bubble where nothing beyond their apartment walls seemed quite real. Patricia sent a package to their new address 2 weeks after Emma's birth. Robert intercepted it before Susan saw, returning it unopened with a letter from Rachel Kim, reminding Patricia of the restraining order terms and threatening further legal action. That evening, holding Emma while Susan showered, Robert made a decision. "I'm changing our phone numbers," he told Susan later, both of them exhausted on the couch while Emma slept in her bassinet. "New numbers, unlisted. My mother's lawyers can reach us through Rachel if there's legitimate legal need, but otherwise we're going dark." It felt radical and necessary. 2 days later, they activated new numbers, informing only essential contacts. Susan's parents in Oregon, Robert's colleagues, their closest friends. The digital disconnection from Patricia felt like finally closing a door that had been wedged open for years. January brought bitter cold and a return to routines. Susan was on maternity leave until March, but Robert went back to work, taking the commuter rail to Boston each morning and returning each evening to help with Emma. Money was tighter than before Patricia's monthly contributions, but they made it work. Meal planning, budgeting apps, second-hand baby clothes from generous co-workers. The financial strain was real but manageable, and more importantly, it was theirs to navigate together. On what would have been their 8th wedding anniversary in February, Susan and Robert celebrated quietly after Emma's bedtime. They ordered Thai food and sat on their balcony despite the cold, bundled in blankets and holding hands. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Robert said suddenly, his breath fogging in the winter air. "To choose you, to protect you, to be the husband you deserved." Susan squeezed his hand, remembering the man who'd frozen in the kitchen 7 months ago while his mother assaulted his pregnant wife, comparing him to the man who now held firm boundaries and changed midnight diapers without complaint. "You're choosing us now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Inside their small apartment, Emma stirred in her bassinet, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Robert stood immediately, moving to tend to their daughter before Susan could rise. Through the sliding glass door, Susan watched him lift Emma with practiced gentleness, his voice low and soothing as he changed her diaper and prepared a bottle. This was the life Patricia's slap had precipitated, smaller in square footage, tighter in finances, but immeasurably larger in freedom and authenticity. Susan thought about that Mother's Day, the white carnations and ruined brunch, the moment of violence that paradoxically liberated them from years of subtle oppression. Patricia had expected Susan to crumble under assault, to retreat into subservience or flee the marriage entirely. She hadn't anticipated that her violence would become the catalyst that finally gave Robert permission to break free, or that Susan's courage would create space for them both to rebuild. The restraining order had 8 months remaining, and Susan harbored no illusions that Patricia would disappear from their lives permanently. But they'd established something more valuable than restraining orders: boundaries backed by action, commitment tested and proven, and a family foundation built on truth rather than money. Robert returned to the balcony with Emma bundled against his chest, her dark eyes blinking up at the night sky. "She's wide awake now," he said ruefully, but his smile was pure contentment. Susan made space for them both, and they sat together in the February cold. 3 people learning how to be a family without the weight of Patricia Aldridge's expectations, crushing them into shapes they were never meant to hold. Emma's small hand wrapped around Susan's finger, and Susan understood with sudden clarity that this was what she'd been fighting for all along, not just survival, but the freedom to define their own version of family, consequence by chosen consequence.